Hello there, my name is Mr. Beasley. Now, if you're being examined on the novel Lord of the Flies, then it's possible you'll be asked to focus your answer on one of the characters, and there's no more significant character than Ralph. Depending on the exam board, you might simply be asked to write about how this character is presented, or how a character is used by the writer to represent an idea. Equally, you might be asked about the relationship between this character and another character, or how a character changes during the course of the novel. All of these possibilities provide some really rich opportunities for discussion and analysis in your response. He's first described in the first sentence of the book as the boy with fair hair. And Golding uses images of darkness and light throughout this story, and so describing him as having light hair immediately gives him some pretty positive associations. A more detailed physical description of Ralph is given a few pages later. He was old enough, 12 years and a few months, to have lost the prominent tummy of childhood, and not yet old enough for adolescence to have made him awkward. You could see now that he might make a boxer as far as width and heaviness of shoulders went, but there was a mildness about his mouth and eyes that proclaimed no devil. He patted the palm trunk softly, and forced at last to believe in the reality of the island, laughed delightedly again and stood on his head. He turned neatly onto his feet, jumped down to the beach, knelt, and swept a double armful of sand into a pile against his chest. Then he sat back and looked at the water with bright, excited eyes. And there are a number of things to draw your attention to here. Firstly, his age, and at 12 he will be one of the older boys on the island. There's also his physicality and attractive appearance. A mildness about his mouth and eyes tells us that this is a kind and gentle person, while no devil marks a clear distinction between Ralph and anything associated with evil. It's also important to note just how excited Ralph is to be on the island. As well as looking around with bright, excited eyes as he does here, we also see him standing on his head, saying how delighted he is that there are no grown-ups. And he makes comparisons to the books that he's read. Ralph thinks his experience on the island will be just like Swallows and Amazons, Coral Island, Treasure Island. So at the start of the novel, Ralph is innocent and naive about the challenges that await him. He thinks it will be fun and a game and liberating from the rules of parents and school. He treats the discovery of the conch in exactly the same way. He doesn't consider how useful or important it will be in getting the boys together and maintaining a sense of order amongst the boys. He just thinks it is interesting and pretty and a worthy plaything. And there's a similar attitude taken to Ralph's election as chief. This toy of voting was almost as pleasing as the conch. And although this view is never tied specifically to Ralph, the link between him, the conch, and his election have clearly been established. The place where all this happens becomes known as the place of assembly, and it's where the boys gather when the conch is blown, a bit like a bell ringing to signal the start of an assembly at school. Certain characters in Lord of the Flies become linked to specific locations, and this is Ralph's. It's on the beach, which is clearly established through Chapter 1 as a very calm and beautiful place. It's also the place where, in Chapter 3, Ralph will build the shelters for the boys to sleep in, and these two symbols of democracy and civilization are key to understanding Ralph's character and how he's used by Golding as the novel progresses. Because Ralph is elected through the democratic process of voting, he becomes associated with this style of leadership, and for all his inexperience, especially when compared to a character like Jack, Ralph initially finds leadership coming quite naturally to him. At the beginning of Chapter 2, Golding writes all at once he found he could talk fluently and explain what he had to say. And he seems to handle Jack's frustration at not being made chief, as well as the bullying of Piggy and Piggy's disappointment at not going with Ralph on the first exploration of the island at the end of Chapter 1 diplomatically enough. Better Piggy than Fatty, he said at last, with the directness of genuine leadership. And anyway, I'm sorry if you feel like that. Now go back, Piggy, and take names. That's your job. So long. Ralph bonds much more naturally with Jack, who he seems to have much more in common with, but this friendship quickly becomes strained as they fall into their allotted roles, while Jack is off having fun hunting in the forest, Ralph is on the beach doing the responsible thing and trying to build shelters. Chapter 3 is useful to show how Ralph's understanding, not just of leadership, but of people more generally, is starting to change and mature. People don't help much, he said. He wanted to explain how people were never quite what you thought they were. And so he's starting to realise that being chief isn't a game, and that leadership is tough, full of responsibilities, and that motivating people is really difficult. One of the key examples of the stress these differing priorities puts on Ralph's friendship with Jack happens in Chapter 4, Painted Faces and Long Hair. Jack has taken the older boys, including Sam and Eric, who are meant to be on duty at the fire, hunting. And for the first time, they are successful. They kill a pig and proudly march it up the mountain to the fire. With the watchers gone, the fire goes out, and unfortunately, in a coincidence that is deeply symbolic, another thing that happened while they were away hunting is that a ship has passed the island and the chance of rescue has disappeared. This moment marks not only a definite shift in Ralph's feelings towards Jack, but also his feelings towards Piggy. Ralph is furious at Jack's negligence, and even as he and the other hunters try to make up for it by building the fire, Ralph refuses to move. No one, not even Jack, would ask him to move, and in the end they had to build the fire 3 yards away and in a place not really as convenient. So Ralph asserted his chieftainship and could not have chosen a better way if he'd thought for days. Against this weapon so indefinable and so effective, Jack was powerless and raged without knowing why. By the time the pile was built, they were on different sides of a high barrier. The significance of Ralph and Jack now being on different sides of a high barrier is really effective at describing what has happened to their friendship, and while this link has been snapped, it's been fastened onto Piggy. Ralph has started to appreciate the value of all that Piggy represents. Intelligence, clear thought, good ideas, and through his constant association with the conch, democracy. We can see another good example of his appreciation for these values in Beast from Water. Ralph has made a mistake in calling a meeting late in the evening when the sun is going down and the imagination of the boys is at its most potent. The boys end up talking about supernatural rubbish like ghosts, and some of the younger boys become frightened, and as the assembly descends into chaos, Ralph turns to Piggy for reassurance. Further evidence of how Ralph changes as a character can be seen at the beginning of Chapter 7, Shadows and Tall Trees. Sitting, Ralph was aware of the heat for the first time that day. He pulled distastefully at his grey shirt and wondered whether he might undertake the adventure of washing it. Sitting under what seemed an unusual heat, even for this island, Ralph planned his toilet. He would like to have a pair of scissors and cut this hair. He flung the mass back. Cut this filthy hair right back to 1/2 inch. He would like to have a bath, a proper wallow with soap. He passed his tongue experimentally over his teeth and decided that a toothbrush would come in handy too. Then there were his nails. Now, we can see here Ralph craving a more civilised existence. He wants to be clean and neat, which is a far cry from the excitement he felt in the first 2 chapters. We also find him daydreaming about his old life with its cottages, ponies and children's books. A place where everything was all right, everything was good-humoured and friendly. And this distant memory of his civilised past is juxtaposed with the savagery of the hunt. And in this chapter, we see Ralph getting involved too. Ralph keeps repeating, I hit him, and he's clearly excited and proud of what he's done, even going so far as to feel that hunting was good after all. And this is a subtlety in the story that is well worth taking note of. Golding is saying some pretty bleak things about human nature in this novel, about the idea that all humans are essentially flawed and have the capacity for evil. The group's slow slide from civilised public school boys to savages and hunters is indicative of how all of us can fall prey to that instinct towards evil and destruction. Even Ralph. And believe it or not, the clues were there as far back as chapter 1. Remember that paragraph I showed you, which contains the first physical description of Ralph? Well, the paragraph before that contains this line, which could really easily be overlooked on first reading it. But of course, we know the significance of snakes in this novel, how they're linked to the devil and evil more generally. And here is Ralph, the character who is most representative of the force for good being associated with them. And the message is that everyone, given the right circumstances, has the potential for evil. The boys carried it with them when they were evacuated from their schools, and it was there as part of their personalities when they crash-landed on the Paradise Island. And in chapter 7, we see evidence of this in Ralph. He even gets involved in the reenactment, which becomes part of the hunting ritual. More evidence for this idea can be found at the beginning of chapter 10. Now, by this point, obviously things have really started to break up on the island. Jack has tried to overthrow Ralph by having a second election, which he again loses, and so has stormed off to set up his own tribe at Castle Rock, the location he is most associated with. This bit of description takes place immediately after the death of Simon, a death that was precipitated by darkness, a storm and violent tribal dancing, and Ralph was involved in this too. I mean, just look at the state of him, limping, dirty, with a puffy cheek and a great scab on his knee. We don't know if he was directly involved in the murder of Simon, but he was there and he was part of the violence that accompanied it. So, as I've said, one of the ways that Ralph is used by Golding is to show that everyone has the potential for evil given the right set of circumstances. Another way he's used is to show how vulnerable democratically elected leaders are in the face of rising powerful dictators. Golding was in the Navy during World War II and so knew a thing or two about fighting dictatorships. And in Lord of the Flies, this is represented by the power struggle that exists between Ralph and Jack. Ralph is the responsible, democratically elected leader who wants to get the boys rescued, which, let's face it, is the sensible thing to do. But this involves work, which in itself is represented by the constant tending of the signal fire. Eventually, most of the boys get tired of this effort and instead go off to join Jack, where they can play at being a tribe and have fun hunting. We can see signs of this struggle from this section that I've selected from the end of chapter 6, when the boys have trekked across the island in search of the beast. They discover Castle Rock and want to stay and play, but Ralph wants them to go back to the mountain and relight the signal fire. He's so frustrated by their lack of urgency and inability to see the importance of the signal fire that he smashes his hand on a rock and scrapes the skin off his knuckles. The boys respond by doing as they're told, but the adverb mutinously is really interesting in showing how Ralph's slender grip on authority is slipping away. It also links cleverly to the description of the island as being roughly boat-shaped in chapter 1. We know that at the end of the story, Ralph's power has disappeared completely. Simon and Piggy have been killed, Sam and Eric have been captured by Jack's tribe, and Ralph is injured, alone and being hunted by the other boys. In the end, Ralph is ironically saved by a fire that was lit by Jack, not Ralph, and lit to kill rather than save him. A passing Navy ship sees the smoke created by the burning island, and the officer rescues Ralph from a grisly death. The officer nodded helpfully. I know, jolly good show, like the Coral Island. Ralph looked at him dumbly. For a moment he had a fleeting picture of the strange glamour that had once invested the beaches, but the island was scorched up like dead wood. Simon was dead and Jack had... The tears began to flow and sobs shook him. He gave himself up to them now for the first time on the island, great shuddering spasms of grief that seemed to wrench his whole body. His voice rose under the black smoke before the burning wreckage of the island, and infected by that emotion, the other little boys began to shake and sob too. And in the middle of them all, with filthy body, matted hair and unwiped nose, Ralph wept for the end of innocence, the darkness of man's heart, and the fall through the air of the true wise friend called Piggy. So the final section of the book is incredible at revealing just how much Ralph has changed from the innocent, naive child of chapter 1. The officer using the same literary reference to Coral Island that Ralph himself did in chapter 2 to try and show his understanding of what it must have been like for the boys. Only now Ralph can see how ludicrous this comparison is. Far from being an adventure full of exciting scrapes, youthful heroism and happy endings, Simon and Piggy are dead, and Jack had tried to murder him. The beach, that location so associated with Ralph and the attempt to build the civilization that it represents, has been scorched up like dead wood, and the whole island is now just a burning wreckage. In the end, Ralph cries for the first time since being on the island. He weeps for the end of innocence and the darkness of man's heart. He's learned about the burden of responsibility, the struggle to survive, and the evil of humanity. His innocence is gone. He knows that life is not fun and games. He's also learned about friendship. Piggy, who he showed no interest in when they first met in chapter 1, is now recognised as a true, wise friend. Ralph was not discerning in his choice of friends at the start of the novel. He liked Jack because he recognised him as somebody a bit like himself, whereas Piggy looked different, sounded different, and enjoyed different things. But now he knows that true friendship needs to be based on more substantial qualities than this, being honest, for example, or being wise. In the end, Ralph is able to reassert his chieftainship, while Jack, perhaps wisely, decides it would be better for him to keep a low profile. And there is something to celebrate there, but this is not a happy ending like that of Coral Island, and the reality is that Ralph may have been rescued from one area of conflict on a remote Pacific island, but he's only going to be taken to a much larger area of conflict involving the rest of the world.